John Ossoff benefited from an unusually strong turnout in the first round of voting in Georgia's 6th congressional district last week, surpassing all recent benchmarks for Democratic turnout in an off-year election, according to an upshot analysis of newly released voting data. Past Democratic primary voters represented a larger share of the district's voters than they did in 2016 or 2014, and they turned out in greater numbers than in a typical midterm election. The election in Georgia's 6th is only the latest in a string of special elections where Democrats have turned out in impressive numbers. It's a reversal from recent off-year elections, when Republicans turned out at far greater rates than Democrats. If the pattern holds into next year's midterm elections, it will help the party's long-shot goal to win back the House. Historically, Democratic midterm turnout has been stronger when Republicans hold the presidency. The Republican turnout was not weak. Past Republican primary voters turned out at rates that were nearly typical for a midterm, a rare feat for a special election. It was enough to keep Mr. Ossoff beneath the 50% necessary to win outright. But Democrats did something even rarer. A larger percentage of Democratic primary voters turned out than did Republican primary voters, by a 4 percentage point margin. Even when Democrats surged in successful years nationally in 2006, 2008 and 2012, their turnout of primary voters didn't beat that of the Republicans, either nationwide or in Georgia's 6th. Not all of the news was good for Democrats. The electorate was not as favorable for Mr. Ossoff as the electorate was for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election. The electorate was almost exactly as old and white as would be expected in a normal midterm electorate. This is not surprising. There is no recent precedent for a strong turnout among young and non-white voters in midterm elections. But this sort of pattern would hamper Democrats in relatively diverse districts where they depend more on non-white voters, like those in Southern and Central California, South Florida and Texas. But Democrats nonetheless did a far better job of turning out younger and less regular voters than the Republicans did. Overall, 56% of Democratic primary voters under age 45 turned out to vote, compared with 43% of past Republican primary voters of the same age. Similarly, 45% of past Democratic primary voters who didn't vote in the 2014 midterm elections ultimately voted, compared with 34% of Republicans. The strong Democratic turnout wasn't the only reason Mr. Ossoff came close to winning last Tuesday's election, and could still win in June's runoff. Mr. Ossoff, who won 48% of the vote, plainly won a considerable share of past Republican primary voters, who outnumbered Democrats by a margin of 52% to 29%. The implication is that Mr. Ossoff probably won 15 to 20% of past Republican primary voters, and around two-thirds of those who had never voted in a partisan primary. His strength among past Republican primary voters was most evident in the early and absentee vote. Mr. Ossoff won 64% of early and absentee voters, even though past Democratic and Republican primary voters each represented 41% of the group. Win or lose, the strong turnout for Mr. Ossoff indicates that Democrats might not be hampered by low turnout to the extent they have been in recent off-year elections. Alone, it won't be enough to ensure that the party has a big day next November. or even does particularly well. But it's probably a prerequisite to greater success.